All right, great. Good evening, everyone. This is Bob Tremblay, Superintendent of Schools in Framingham. I hope you're having a good evening and taking a break from this unusually warm day, but I hope you're enjoying some time outside and socially distanced from one another. I'm here this evening with Lynch, our Executive Director of Finance and Operations. And the purpose of tonight is really just to, as we have been trying to do all along, is to be transparent and open with our community about what our spending priorities are, what's happening in education. There's a lot of information for us to try to cover, but I also want to make sure we leave time tonight for questions. And we are recording this for future broadcasts, so in case there are folks who are missing it, there'll be an opportunity to watch this at a later date. And I encourage you, if you do have questions, to include them in the chat box of this presentation as we're talking. And our moderators will provide those questions in a separate document so that we can be responsive to those over the course of our presentation. So it's just after 5 o'clock this evening. We have allotted about an hour this evening. There's a couple of other meetings that are happening tonight that we'll need to attend. So we'll give time and space for about an hour to go through a fairly high-level presentation on the school budget. Just by way of introduction to that this has gone through a number of iterations, and as Mr. Lynch will describe it in the details of his presentation, we started this process back in the fall, and of course back in the fall it was an entirely different world than it is right now. And so we continue to go back and revisit the budget, the priorities, the spending, and obviously find ways to continue to sharpen our pencil, as it were, to drive down the operating costs of our budget. So more to be said about that over the course of the evening today. But again, this presentation is intended to be really focused on the school budget and how it has evolved. And if we have some time in the presentation, I'm happy to also address questions that may be burning around, reopening of school or anything school related, which all of which has some relevance, of course, to the school budget. But there may be some specific information that I can try to answer, even if that answer is just that more information will be coming. So that said, that's just my hopefully my warm introduction to all of you. Thank you for taking the time to join us once again this evening. And on behalf of the Framingham School Committee and the leadership team of our district and our staff, again, thanks for your advocacy for school and taking an interest in school operations. So that said, I'll turn it over to Lincoln. Lincoln Lynch, again, Executive Director of Finance and Operations. I'm asked Link to pull up his PowerPoint presentation for this evening and talk us through the budget, which we have shared in some other public meetings to date. Link, good evening. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Dr. Tremblay. Joanna, can I ask you to give me permission to share? I'm trying to pull it up and it's saying that the host has restricted.
Yep, sorry, you should be good now.
There we go. How's that look, Dr. Tremblay?
Looks great on my end.
Okay. Okay, so as Dr. Tremblay mentioned, this has been a long process. It started back in October. I believe it was October 4th is when budget request sheets are sent out from my office to all principals, all directors. They have a month to fill out their requests, both expense side and salary side. And from there, it's kind of a starting point. Sometimes it becomes more of a wish list. So we had over a 10% request when you put everything together. So we've brought that down significantly to where we are today. So we were over a 10% increase. Like I mentioned, the school committee voted on a 6.4% increase on April 1st. That's what the budget book is based off of. And that was, the final submission to the mayor to include in her citywide budget. That increase was $8,865,946. Recently, there have been reductions to the city budget as a whole. So we are actually currently at a 2.38% increase, which is still an increase from last year's FY20 budget. But we went from just over 8.8 million down to 3.3 million. So when we try to kind of look at, budgets and how we really want to at least get level serviced, meaning you keep everyone you have in the current FY20 year, and carry that to FY21. That number, of course, you have to factor in some increases to certain contracts, such as the bus contract with Durham, 2.5% increase for next year, some increase to out-of-district tuitions, and then just, your year-to-year small percentage increase that adds up with a district the size of ours. So when we look at the overall level services budget, which is the screen that you see here, is just over 6.6 million. So you might have heard in past meetings and probably moving forward, we consider it a $3.3 million difference between where we are now with the mayor's budget at about 3.3 million and what level service looks like for us for 21, which is just over 6.6. So we've been working to really try to get to, close that gap and figure out ways how to do it. And, the directors and the principals, assistant superintendents, and Dr. Tremblay, we've all worked really hard. We talk budget daily to really get to a number that allows other city departments to flourish as well. But it also supports all students district-wide. So you'll see on the last slide here, kind of to wrap it up, to show you how we close that gap. And that's the proposal that you'll see, like I said on that last slide. So here, this is what makes up the 6.6 million. Salaries is always the biggest number. We have 6 unions that have, contractual obligations, certain percent COLAs plus steps and lanes. So, most unit A is 1.65. Most other unions now are 2% increases, but it's not just the 2%. The people who see the 2% are on the top lanes and don't move, are on the top step and don't move a lane. So they're the only ones that see a true COLA. Most of the staff are moving the COLA plus a step down. So you see a little bit bigger of a percent increase. So that's what makes up, that large, almost 3.4 million in salary increases. We had $3,472,000 in new position requests. That was included in the overall 10% all-in budget that we called it back in November. So we reduced that 3.4 million in new position requests down to let me back up a little. We put those positions in buckets. So we talked about legal compliance. We talked about contractual compliance that have to do with the recommended class sizes in all the contracts. Then we bucketed the positions in the top priority. So when the directors and principals were submitting these new requests, I had them prioritize, in case, we didn't get the funding, kind of where we are now, that their top priorities, hopefully we could get them for next year to support our kids. So we basically are down from 3.4 million to just over 1.2. And that 1 million are all legal salaries, legal compliance salaries. So as you can imagine, that's a big number to factor in. And then we have some positions we're going to add, or we're looking to add at Fuller and Barbary based on enrollment. That's just over 204,000. And then what we've done the last few years, we build in turnover savings. We are proposing next year, you build in $1.5 million in turnover savings, meaning we budget, now or in April, when the budget was submitted at a $90,000 position. That $90,000 position could either decide to retire, resign, and move to a different district, and we bring in a person to replace that $90,000, and it could be a $50,000 position. That's a $40,000 immediate savings, which adds up quickly, across all salaries when you have as many staff members as we do. So we build in that $1.5 million to drive down, a possible, because if you don't do that, then you see an available balance at the end of the year. And we really want to, we've gone through this budget with a fine-tooth comb, and we have the past couple of years, and we really feel like building that turnover savings really reflects the true request that we need and drives down that available balance at the end of the year, which sometimes, you build in to the next year's budget to offset more than not. It's in the circuit breaker account to offset the out-of-district tuitions for the following year. That was a practice in my district that I came from, the Norton Public Schools. And I actually put out a survey to all of my fellow business officials across the state, and an overwhelming amount do the same thing. They push to have almost a year's worth of circuit breaker in that carryover to offset the next year. So you're not pulling funds from other areas and increasing your FY20 or your following year operating budget. That carryover in circuit breaker is, for two things. It's to offset and balance a budget, and it's for any new move-in special ed students that come into Framingham that we are financially responsible for. That gives you a pot of money that allows you to cover that and not take from other places in the operating budget. So I can't stress that enough, that circuit breaker carryover is a practice across the state and something that is used to balance the budget. Additional salaries is an increase of $491,000. Those are things such as custodial overtime, athletic coaches, tutoring, translations. It's things above and beyond what you consider, quote unquote, a normal salary for someone. So that increases, like I said, is over $490,000. On the expense side, it's an over $3 million increase. Which, that makes up everything that is not on the salary side. So your bus contracts, your copiers, your paper, your day-to-day supplies, your classroom supplies, your office supplies. With 15 schools and as many departments as we have, that number adds up quickly. And we really went line by line, which we do every year, look at historical spending and really cut where we can to reduce that number. And we do that across the board, expenses and salaries. So when all is said and done, it's a $6,617,499 level service budget for the school department. So from there, I broke down what the salaries, kind of a formula that shows what last year's salaries were, what the increase we're looking for, and then that turnover savings factored in. So on the salary side, it is $105.5 million for salaries. And then for each unit, Unit A, professional staff; Unit B, administrators; C, custodians; P, principals; S, secretaries; T, support staff like paraprofessionals; and Unit V are non-bargaining, such as myself. I follow into Unit V. So it's staff members that have individual contracts or fall under school committee policy. And that's the breakdown as it relates to each unit. Unit C, there's a P in parentheses next to the increase. That's my projected increase based on contract negotiations and the contract that we're hoping to wrap up before the fiscal year for our custodians. The additional salaries, this is just a couple things, couple notes of large increases. So there have been some questions about the substitutes and the increase there. Last year, we ran into not having the amount of substitutes that we really should have. We thought our rate might have been a little too low. So we increased by $10 last year, and the proposal is to increase another $10. So that daily rate, that really brings us to the middle of the pack in the area. Because what we think have been happening, folks that are looking to substitute for a day, they call around to different districts. And of course, you're going to go to the district that pays the most. So we were kind of seeing not the percent coverage that we would like to see last year. So, when the financial situation was a little bit more stable, we really wanted to make sure that our substitutes, we were attracting substitutes as best we can. I mentioned tutoring earlier. That number projected is going up, and this is all over historical spending and having conversations with directors and principals. Translations has been through the roof. Our translation department has been amazing and instrumental throughout this remote learning, but the costs have increased. So we're going to factor that in for next year. Next slide. Okay, so these are the new positions that are in the 6.4% increase request. As you can see, the legal compliant positions, mostly all special ed positions, where we need to abide by and adhere to the IEPs of all of our students, which we strive to do, day in and day out. Laura Spear, the director of special education, does a great job, and her team. So these positions support our special ed students across the district. The 3.4 positions based on enrollment, they actually fell into a category other than the legal compliant. Burberry, based on an increase in enrollment, conversations with the Department of Health and Wellness, we're asking for a 1.0 nurse to be added to Burberry. And then at Fuller, with the 5th grade coming from the King Elementary School, there's 2.4 positions: social studies 1.0, FD, physical ed 1.0 teacher, and a 0.4 chorus position. That's included in the $1.2 million in new positions that I spoke about earlier. These are expenses. I figure the best way to show this by school, by category of schools. So your high school, so high school and Thayer, then your middle schools, elementary schools. Those are all the increases. You see some decreases there. And again, that just shows that, we don't take what we had in FY20 and add 3%. We go line by line, and we have our directors and principals and other staff really show what is actually needed, what vendors you're going to use, if you need to get quotes, if something's over $10,000 per the Massachusetts General Law, Chapter 30B, procurement law. So we go through fine-tooth comb. So this just shows, while there are increases in some, I'm looking at health and wellness here. There's some grant funding that just discontinued after FY20, so we have to account for it to continue those initiatives. But you see some negatives, which are decreases from FY20 to 21, meaning we really go through and make sure we only budget what we need, and that's based on historical spending. So that's through business operations, and then these are continued all the departments, and that total increase for FY21 requests is over $3 million. So the expense side of the budget, $33,425,104. So I keep talking about the $3.3 million budget gap. In March, when the COVID situation occurred, we froze hiring. The only people we had, a semi-freeze, I guess you could call it, because we still continued to hire replacements for classroom positions, for ESL positions and special ed positions that were going to be in front of students. We didn't want to put a full-on freeze because students would suffer. They wouldn't have that teacher in front of them. Even though it's remote, and I know it's not the same, it's still important. And those are the positions that we continued to hire. But other than that, we had, I believe, 27 open positions that we did not fill. So that shows a savings, and that will show at the end of the year. When the budget season started, we thought Student Opportunity Act was going to be, the greatest thing since the 1993 ed reform. The Chapter 70 state aid formula was revised, was looked at, and it showed that some certain things have been underfunded: special ed, health insurance, and Framingham was looking to get almost a $7.1 million increase in Chapter 70. With a $4 to $6, and some say even more, $1 billion state revenue deficit, our assumption is Student Opportunity Act funding will not happen in 21. It could not happen in 22. That's a possibility. So we have to build our budget around not expecting any Student Opportunity Act funding. So when they sent that out, there was a difference, a split between what your typical Chapter 70 would have been and what your Student Opportunity Act money would have been. Because if you remember, we put together many slideshows and presentations on the programs that the Department of Ed wanted us to fund new initiatives moving forward in FY21. Use this money to get all these programs going, new initiatives to reach students that might have fallen behind over the years. And we were gung ho, ready to do this. We were putting together plans, and then things drastically changed. So next year's budget is based on that amount, the typical Chapter 70 money, which is 2.7 million. So a large increase from our large decrease from our $7.1 million hope that we were going to get. So for those math people at home, it's about a $4.4 million decrease, $4,347,096 decrease from what we thought in Chapter 78. So we're still hoping to look at $53.7 million in Chapter 78 from the state, which is a huge number, but it's a lot less than what we thought. We're looking at FEMA and CARES Act reimbursement. So any COVID-related expenses, we are applying and have applied for, and will continue to keep track of to seek reimbursement. And hopefully we'll get 100% reimbursement on things like Chromebooks, postage to send out Chromebooks, online platforms, PPE, things like that. And that's really the only expenses that we're making since March 11th, I believe, or March 12th was the day that we canceled school. So really, we've put a freeze on most expenses and most hiring, because we knew we were going to have to generate an available balance to end the year to help FY21. That was just the mindset going into it. I think we've done a great job doing it. Directors, principals have been phenomenal, understanding the dire financial situation that we're in. So, it's a great team that we have, district-wide, that they're really grasping and understanding, the next couple of years. And financially, it's going to be tough to recover. It's going to be a multi-year recovery process. The fourth topic here to address that $3.3 million difference, revolving funds. So for instance, we have a buildings and grounds revolving account. If groups rent out our buildings, they pay a fee through the permit process. That goes into a revolving account and is used to help out with expenses to keep the buildings running. Paper towels, toilet paper, just general supplies to keep the buildings running. So we will count more on those revolving accounts than what was presented in our 6.4% increase. So the buildings and grounds expense will increase, and the athletic revolving expense. Some might ask, how are you doing that athletic revolving when we don't charge fees? We still charge gate fees. We don't charge the user fees for the students. And there was some funding left over. So that money will not be sustainable. That's about a 2, maybe 3-year plan to use those funds and to slowly build it back into the operating, because that's a short-term fix. But I feel like to close this budget difference, the drastic measures have to be taken. Would I do that in a normal financial situation? No, it's not the best practice. But things are different now. Times are different. We have to adapt and be more creative. So that's the way to do it. I talked about already the savings, the carry forward. That's going to result in that end of year balance. If you've been following school committee, I provide end of year balance projections. My team in business operations, my accounts payable staff, my assistant director, Deb Irvine, and our salary manager, Paul Lamerding. We've really been working on the salary side and the expense side, close out purchase orders, figure out where we're going to save on both sides, salary and expense, and project out to school committee and the community what those savings are going to look like at the end of the year, because it's going to factor into the FY21 budget. Number 6, and you'll see it on the next slide, we're going to save about $370,000 by going remote over the summer. That's $300,000 in salaries. You know, we're still running remote, but as you can imagine, as many salaried positions that we need in a normal summer situation, we do not need. So we'll save, and we're not busing students anywhere. So that's a $70,000 savings, summer transportation that was budgeted. So we will reduce that by $370,000. So here's the plan to, as of today, to reduce our budget request from April 1st, the 6.4% increase, and to where we are today. So the latest recommendation for the school department is just under that 3.3 million I talked about a couple minutes ago, a 2.38% increase. So we need to work to cut $5,569,000 from our budget request from April 1st. So to get there, I'll run through real quick. Summer salaries, $370,000 savings through the salaries and transportation. Reducing contractual positions, $636,000, which was part of the $3.4 million new position requests that came out of our budget discussions. So reducing that by that contractual position bucket, $636,000. The tier 1 new positions, we're reducing that by $1.2 million. The only tier 1s are the positions I talked about earlier, the 3.4 FTEs, 2.4 at Fuller, 1.0 at Barbary for the nurse. Then the bucket was anything tier 2 or beyond, we put into a bucket. We're reducing all of those positions, 408,675. There have been some folks that will stay with us for next year that we had budgeted as retired. So I have to add back in $68,000. And then the next two lines are the revolving accounts that I talked about. We'll be adding an additional $50,000 budgeted in the athletic revolving account to cover what were operating expenses in the April 1st budget. So a total of $100,000 will be used from athletic revolving. Like I said, that's not sustainable for more than, I say 3. I think we could stretch it to 3, but I'm comfortable saying, really comfortable saying 2 years. So in year 3, FY23, we'll have to build that back in, and we'll do so over 22 and 23. So that revolving account, it takes less of a hit. The next line is that buildings and grounds revolving account that I talked about. That's an additional $100,000. So my initial budget was $150,000 out of revolving to offset operating account expenses. That's now at $250,000. Those fees that come in can sustain it in a normal year. I'm a little hesitant as we move forward how we are going to, and if we're going to rent out our buildings. When will that be acceptable? When will we be able to do that and follow the guidelines, social distancing guidelines? So that's something in the back of my mind that we continue to talk about. That things they're changed. We got to think differently. So that's what we're doing. And then I talked a little bit earlier about the circuit breaker carryover. I had already budgeted $1.5 million to carry in that circuit breaker account. So I was already projecting in April a $1.5 million surplus to be carried in circuit breaker to cover FY21 out of district special ed tuitions. With the budget difference that we're looking at, I'm recommending that it increases by 2.8 million. So the total would be a $4.3 million carry from FY20 to 21 to offset out of district tuitions. And like I said, this is not something that is out of the ordinary. Most all districts do it, and those that don't really want to and try to get there to do it. In the actual DESE guidelines and language for circuit breaker, which is the reimbursement program for out of district tuitions, it says in there, the best practice is to carry 1 year of circuit breaker. So in FY20, we received, I believe, $5.4 million in circuit breaker. So the best practice would be to carry 5.4 million in circuit breaker from 20 to 21 to offset the budget and to cover any costs that we just were not expecting, students that move in mid-year. And that has happened. In Norton, I had a year where 16 students moved in, 16 in 1 year. So it happens. So to be, fiscally prepared for that, that's why those guidelines are in there with the state to carry that 1 year of circuit breaker. So we're about $1 million less than that, than the ideal situation to carry. So that's the rundown of how or what the recommendation is now to close the budget gap. And I think that's my quick presentation. I'll unshare the screen.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Yeah, perfect. I appreciate you guys. That's about 5:30. I appreciate taking about, that's just what I had hoped about the amount of time. Some questions have been coming up that I'll try my best to moderate and kind of share between us. So thanks again for that overview. And just to underscore some of the points that have been made, we started this budget process in the fall, and at the time, we're anticipating fully that Student Opportunity Act money is coming to help us expand preschool, to help us build out really innovative practices, to expand on some of our existing practices. We're developing a strategic plan at the same time for the next 3 years to build upon all the foundation. March comes and this comes to a crashing halt. We pivot, we go back, we reinvent the budget. We put everything sort of on hold, having to reprioritize and basically put blinders on and operate the rest of the year in the dark. And that's presented a tremendous challenge for us, not only just financially, but as we try to lead the school department. And it's not because anyone's withholding information, it's because everyone in the world is trying to figure out how to manage a pandemic and how to keep business moving and how to keep children learning and how to keep everyone, most importantly, safe and fed and cared for. And so that really has been the priority. We pivoted and shifted our thinking to saying the most important thing we can do is make sure we get meals to families. Believe it or not, our first instinct wasn't to make sure that we could make sure that that every child has a Chromebook. I mean, that was step two. I mean, as you think about the hierarchy of needs, one could argue that internet is probably just as important as sustenance as food is. And so we had an obligation to provide both. When the state, and even when we closed school. And if you watched the meeting yesterday that I had with the mayor, I appreciated the opportunity to have a conversation with the community and the mayor about this. When we closed school, we had every intention of coming back a couple of days later. It wasn't until school was closed for a couple of weeks by me, then later extended by the governor. So we thought we'd be back in 3 weeks. At the time, education was just planning for us to say, how can we just sort of keep afloat? How can we manage the teaching and learning while we're out of school temporarily until we come back? And so it was providing resources. It was getting technology into the hands of students whose parents, didn't have a technology at home for them to use. So we were able to do that. Suddenly, we're sheltering in place at home. We're in a quarantine environment, and the school year is now extended the closure to April. That became the first game changer significantly for how we deal with teaching and learning. Now, on the fly, we're training our teachers to be remote teachers and bringing the world into each other's kitchens and living rooms and study space and backyards. And suddenly a very school-based world became a very home-based educational model for which nobody was prepared. So we continue to operate at the same time, going back to reevaluating the budget, saying, well, what does that mean now for us and how we spend our money? What are the priorities? And so we've been trying to address that at the same time, which is, again, to underscore the points that Lincoln made, is that we froze the budget with the exception of expenses, unless they were directly related in the current fiscal year to those operations that would sustain remote learning. But lo and behold, the school year is then, chronologically, is closed for the remainder of the school year. And still some question as to when and how we'll reopen. And no community has that figured out. There's lots of speculation. The Boston Globe has released an article today about that very topic. There's a lot of information coming out from around the world on reopening of school successes and failures. And we're trying to take all that into account. Just today, I had a call with the Commissioner of Education on reopening and the priority. The priority wasn't in the call. It wasn't about teaching and learning, as you might imagine. It was about making sure that you can't open the doors until you have ensured that you have enough PPE, personal protective equipment, for every staff member and every child. That's number one. We've never operated in a space where wearing a face covering to school was something that you not only had to do. In fact, we were just the other way. If you remember the days, you couldn't wear a hood in school. You'd take it off, or a hat. Now we have face covering. The whole world around education and what we've come to know and understand about education has changed and continues to evolve. The more challenging part to keep this focused on the budgeting for the future is that what we know we have, and I called this out very early on, when the state decided to deepen teaching and learning standards. Basically, students came to school, they were learning something from September, and they learned something until March in a variety of topics and subjects. And that learning, in some cases, stopped. We tried to recreate to the extent we could in a remote environment, but we know all too well that not every family has the same means. Not everyone has the same access to technology, has lifestyles at home that allow a child to engage in school, even if the teacher is engaging with that child or making the effort. Many of our families, they're students that are working to make ends meet because they have sick parents. And these are the realities that we're taking into consideration as we plan this. And to plan to go forward, how do we continue to do that? What we know to be true is however we return back to school, however that will look, and we're building a task force to look at all of that. However we return, it's going to be different, number one. And number two is that we've got to account for the lost learning that has happened. To think for a minute that we have served every one of our students well in every part of our community is a failed thought. We have not. We've done our best to tread water in these unprecedented times. But to be sure, what we need to do is to get educators in front of children to make sure we can remediate and catch everybody up from the point that we left off. And we know where they left off because we've been tracking that. We've been making sure that we engage with families, and for the families that are not engaging with us, we make reaches to these families in native languages to make sure that they're cared for, to make sure that they have a meal for their family, to make sure they have the technology they need to access if they can. That's a huge if. So we have a lot of remediation. So it seems to me the most important money we can spend is the money that puts teachers and support staff and counselors, and I didn't even get into the mental health needs, which you saw in the budget. That's really important. There's a lot of trauma we have to manage. There's a lot of re-entry into a world where students left their teachers with no closure. You have retirees who never had a chance to say goodbye. So you have all these dynamics at play, and we're thinking about all of that. Is there an opportunity to come back to school and connect with the last year's teacher to have some closure and then move on? So you're seeing educators stepping up to say, I was going to retire, but I didn't have the closure that I wanted in my career and with my kids, and I'm stepping back into that. There's some of that going on. So that explains some of the decision making. I'm concerned about the budget, not only for FY21, but for FY22 and 23. We're hearing that state revenues are falling short, $4 to $6 billion. That has certainly an impact, despite the efforts of our legislators to bring in the Student Opportunity Act money. That is probably not going to be an option for us, more than likely. It's not been said so, but more than likely not an option for us. So how do we spend money the right way? And so tonight at 7 o'clock, I'll be meeting with the school committee on some additional suggestions on how to further reduce our operating costs that don't get in the middle of direct instruction and support for our students. So I want to underscore that one more time. That is the most important money that we can spend, because that's the remediation that's going to make the difference as to what has happened. And again, we have no crystal ball here to know how education will exactly look. We are building out opportunities to look at with our staff and to really consider what are the priorities that we have to consider for spending. But to be sure, we are operating totally in the dark on some of this. So I wanted to just give that context so you know why we're revisiting the numbers and why we're putting and making some of the shifts that we have been doing in the budget. There's some practical questions that had come up, Link, in the presentation. One, I think I could answer. There's a question around sort of distinguishing between a level funded budget and a level service budget. And so the cost of doing business, in July 1st of 2020 is a different cost, even with the same people, than it was doing it June 30th of 2019 or 2020, rather. That because there's contractual obligations that are built in. There's even in a zero inflation economy, there's still in many cases of union agreements, there's cost of living increases that are factored into there. So the cost of doing business with the same exact staffing is actually more expensive to do that in the subsequent years. So that's an important distinguishing about level funded. Level funded would mean you have the same amount of money you had in the previous fiscal year, which would mean a reduction in operating costs, which would likely fall on the backs of staffing to do that. So that's a point I wanted to make around level service versus level funding. Another question that had come up was around what are these sort of legal compliance? Who's requiring them? What's legal about it? And you know, aren't these unfunded mandates? I mean, one could argue that they're unfunded mandates, but in the case that we're talking about here, legal compliance is a bucket that we've created, which is a student has an IEP, which is by and large a contract that that family and that child has with the school department, and which we are obligated to fulfill. And if that requires certain kinds of services, we're obligated to provide those services. If we fail to provide those services, it puts the city and the school department and the city and taxpayers in a liability position in which you would not only have to make up those services that you failed to provide, you'd probably have to do it at a premium. And on top of that, you pay the legal expenses to settle out these matters in a court of law. So these are really important. This is a very serious proposition, and we take compliance with IEPs as the priority when it comes to spending, as you saw, not to mention the enrollment. There are other buckets, we call these sort of tier one or other compliance areas that we have to be mindful of. There's certain class size caps. If we find that we're coming back to school and classes are larger because our enrollment continues to, remember, in the midst of all this, students continue to enroll. 220 more, in fact, this year than the previous year. So we have to account for those increases as well. And you know, what does that mean for class size? If class size trips a certain amount of students in a class, it's going to warrant the need for an additional support staff. Well, that may be true, but it also may mean that if we have guidance from the state that says you have to have 6-foot distancing and you give them the square footage of a classroom and you have to have that between students, it may not be possible to put students in the same space. You may find that we're having to have an additional classroom. So we have potentially many, many unknown costs that come forward, not the least of which is the protective equipment that I mentioned, but also potentially additional staffing that we haven't even identified here because we don't know what the rules of engagement for returning to school will be. Buses is another example of that. We've been trying to preserve our buses to make sure we don't re-encounter the situation we faced all fall into the winter. It was just about the time that we closed school that our buses were all running on time. And so we tried to preserve our drivers so that when we returned to school in 3 weeks, no wait, 6 weeks, wait, next year, we had drivers at the ready. So the timeline has shifted that. That may impact certainly the drivers, but how do we keep 6-foot distancing on school buses? This is another area that we're going to have to reckon. Do we run multiple tiers of buses? Is the state going to forgive the amount of time on learning that's required? So a student attends a few hours of the day. And if so, what are the parents doing? Are they working and leaving their child at home? Who's the guardian? Who's going to take care of the kid? And so there are spiraling of thousands of questions, which I'm asking, which probably everyone who's watching is asking, and probably every superintendent and principal and teacher in every community around us is asking, because we don't have answers yet, because we've never encountered this before. So I just want to ask for everybody's patience as we work through that process. And I hope that we've been able to explain out some of these questions for you. I'm going to go, Lincoln, I'm going to throw it back to you for a minute. So one of the questions that had come up was, I'm not sure I understand it though, explaining the huge increase in human resource expenses, which was no direct service to students, and what appears to be a decrease in elementary expenses, direct service to students. Can you explain that?
Yeah. So next year we'll be negotiating 6 contracts. So we had to put in, I'm going to pull it up, I'm going to check. I believe we put in $100,000 in the HR budget because all legal expenses are now in the HR budget. So we added an additional $100,000 for legal expenses for negotiations. And that's based on the last time we negotiated. I believe it was right around that number. So that's why. There's a $98,283 increase to the HR budget. And, there's the $100,000 right there. The elementary side. So, I mean, it's tough to look at it year to year by saying, well, they decrease, so you're taking something away from them. But that's not necessarily true. 1 year, an elementary school might need something, and then the next year it doesn't. Or, we really looked at paper during the budget process. And some, based on historical spending and talking to principals, maybe we took out a pallet of paper at $1,000, a pallet. With 9 elementary schools, I believe it's $23,000 decrease. That adds up quickly. And you really have to think about budgeting differently the way we're doing it, which is a zero-based budget. You're not just taking them and saying you should give them a 3% increase and then figure out, what the details are. This is, you need to tell us exactly what the kids, what you need to support the students. And doing it that way, you get to an exact number that supports all the kids in the building, which we want to get to. It's not just saying, oh, good, that school got a 3% increase from last year, so they're set. This budget reflects exactly what the principals, the directors believe that the students need to excel in each building. So we're very comfortable with these budget numbers at the elementary level and the support that we're giving to our students in each school.
Thanks, Lee. Can you just comment on the substitute pay? I know we addressed that. There was you mentioned it in your presentation about by comparison and then we adjustment for that. What is now? What's the going rate, or what's the rate that we're paying, or the adjustment? Do you know that?
So it's the increase is $274,000 from last year, from this current year to next year, and that accounts for the increase that happened in January of this past year, and then the increase that's proposed in July. Like I talked about, we were finding that we weren't getting enough substitute coverage, so we had to increase that rate.
Do you remember the daily rate on that? Not the overall total?
You know what? I don't.
I
want to say it's 120.
Okay.
But
we were definitely not competitive.
No, we were not. Let me check on that real quick. Maybe.
Okay.
Yeah,
I can try to go on. We had a question that was raised previously, but I'll ask it. I have the answer here. You already responded to it. So the question was, how much in the FY21 budget is just to cover cost of living adjustment increases, not steps and lanes, just COLAs, cost of living adjustments. So let me, just for people who may not be familiar with how teacher schedules and things work, just to frame that up. So the question is, cost of living adjustments. Again, you could have no inflation economies. Those do happen from year to year or limited, but that's a number factored in. What teachers do have, and many do have in their contracts, is what we call steps and lanes. So as a teacher has more years of experience, they're able to then, they move a step in the process. Also, as teachers pursue professional development, they get a master's degree, which they have to have within 5 years of employment anyway. But they have a master's degree, or they get a master's additional credits on top of their master's, or they obtain a doctorate. Those would warrant a lane change in the contract, which means they can move from one lane to the next because of advanced course of study. So it's a built-in incentive to keep our staff current, and it's a professional incentive, but it does come with a cost. But the question specifically was around the COLA increases here, not the steps and lanes, and that increase is $1,144,987,000. So 1,144,987. 1.1 million what counts for the cost of living adjustments in all of our bargaining units. Answer that question. Link, did you able to pull up the answer you did?
Yep. I'm just trying to make Joanna the host again. I guess I forgot to do that. All right, I think that should work. Yeah, so we were paying $90 a day before the change in January. So we proposed a $10 increase starting January 2nd. I have the memo here that we wrote to school committee. So that would bring it up to $100 per day for the per diem substitutes. It would bring the permanent subs up to $120 a day. And we looked at some surrounding districts. Shrewsbury was paying $200 a day. Hanover, $150, Brockton, $140. Let's see, Needham, $119.47. Natick has a structure, $106 a day for the first 15 days. Then it jumps to $119 from day 16 to 90, and then $126 a day for day 91 plus. And, as you can tell, us paying $90 a day was not we weren't getting the subs, we weren't getting the coverage. So we really felt we need to increase that, and it has a direct impact on kids, So that's the reason for the increase in the substitute budget of $274,000.
Okay, thanks for that clarification.
Yep.
There's some other questions that had come in that I'd like to address. One, it's not directly related to budget, although it could be, because, well, let me start with the question. So the question is, if students and their families don't feel comfortable due to health risks coming back to the classroom, how will they be accommodated? And so there's a budgetary impact with that question, to be sure. And so as our task force, we have, as I mentioned before, we have a task force that's focused on several different areas of focus. We've enlisted the voices of we had actually over 130 staff members who expressed an interest in being part of a task force. We're at this point, we're not engaging the entire community and saying, hey, how do you think we should run school? We're doing this because we're going to have to work very strictly within guidelines. This is a bit different than the strategic plan development, which did enlist a lot of community voice, and which I'll be discussing at our upcoming school committee meeting. But the re-entry to school really is going to have to be dictated by local boards of health, local Department of Public Health compliance, CDC compliance, and then directives from the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. So it seems to me, as an educational leader and with our team of leaders, that you pay us what you pay us to make those decisions, to tell families how education should be done in consideration of everyone's health and safety. That said, one of our groups, we have these 6 subcommittees, so we'll have about 40 or so members of our task force that are going to look at physical operations, school safety operations, the whole child, recognizing that social, emotional, mental health needs are at the forefront here. School personnel, how we are addressing staff with who may not feel comfortable coming back. So the question was more about, what if students and families don't feel comfortable? We had that same situation with staff who may be vulnerable, who may be immunocompromised, who may be in an at-risk population, and fear for themselves coming back to work. Can an employee say, no, I'm not coming back to work? Well, probably not, but can we as an employer try to match up the interests and needs of our kids and families with those with our staff? And I can envision a world where you have teachers who prefer to work remotely because it's safer for them until a vaccine is in place, and where students are able to stay home. The parents have a schedule that allows them to continue to work from home, where we could match those two. So that might seem very simplistic as a response, but there's opportunity there that I think we have to begin to think differently about the business of education, as I mentioned before. To be sure, there is licensure considerations. If a teacher is licensed as a science teacher, grades 9 through 12, they may not be the best fit to be a kindergarten teacher. One, that's not their area of expertise, and 2, that's not where their license lives. So there's still compliance with the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education that we have to be mindful of. But this is the big jigsaw puzzle that we're undertaking right now, and looking at all these areas. So we are going to be sensitive to that for sure. Families who just don't feel like it's the time. There is many, I think the recent poll on this was like 41% of families felt like school shouldn't reopen. There are plenty of parents who've been home with their kids since March who feel differently. So how will this look? Will the teacher be in the classroom with 50% of her class in present, and the other 50% at home, tuning in to a Zoom or a Google Meet, watching the class remotely? And that's possible. I think everything is on the table at this point, but we are going to be sensitive to the point that was raised about those safety considerations, because we know there's a lot of worry in the community as we try to address the needs of everybody, staff as well as students and families. I'm just looking through to see what we'll do is we'll put together this as a follow-up document of frequently asked questions. So anything that's been raised in the chat that's appropriate, we will take those questions that have come up, and we'll have responses, and we can post those there. The question, I think, was we come to a close in the last few minutes. I want to give Lincoln an opportunity to get a final word as well. What can residents do to help advocate for the FPS, for FPS receiving the budget it needs at the city or state level? As I mentioned before, our local legislators are really friends of education. They've been phenomenal. All of our state legislators Certainly we have the great fortune of having Senator Karen Spilka, and also Senate President, who's advocating for Framingham all the time and other communities. But certainly we're the beneficiary of the legislature. Some of this is beyond the control. I mean, when revenues are down, I mean, you can either, you decrease spending or you increase revenue. It's not really it's not a magic trick when it comes to finance in that regard. If state revenues are down $4 to $6 billion, it stands to reason that the impact will be felt locally. So I think it's important that people just continue to pay attention, understand what the budget is asking for, so that if we have to make reductions that will be maybe unpopular, that we're doing that because we're trying our best to keep our eye on the prize, which is making sure we minimize the impact when it directly impacts teachers with children. That is the priority of our spending plan. And as you know, 85% or so of our school budget is on personnel. So as cuts deepen, be aware of how those are resolved by our recommendation or by recommendations of other governing boards in the city. Just be paying attention, I guess, would be my advice on that. And again, if you have the chance to tune in tonight at 7 p.m. to a school committee meeting that I've asked for, I'm going to be proposing something there that I think will be another effort to try to help close the gap. So, Link, we're down to our last 4 minutes or so. It's been my first time trying to talk, moderate, and do it all at the same time and stay on the clock. I think we did all right, all things considered. So. Is there anything that you want to share out with anything that we've missed that would be good for the community to know that I've forgotten as I scroll one more time through the questions?
No, I thought you've done a great job.
You too.
Yeah, I just want the community really to know that it's been a collaborative effort, between the schools and the city, really throughout the whole process. Mayor Spicer, the CFO, we've been in contact very often, and it's been a collaborative effort. It really has. And, we try to put the most fiscally responsible budget that we can. And we also understand there are many other departments across the city, that need things to flourish. So like I said, I just like the community to know it's been a collaborative effort. We'll get through it. We'll get to a point. We'll do what we can, whatever we can, so students are not, negatively affected by the final budget number. But we're being creative. We're thinking differently. These times have, forced us to do so. And, some things, such as using more of a revolving account in a normal year isn't the best practice, but, we're trying to do whatever we can to make it work. We'll continue to look at our budget requests. We'll continue to work with directors and principals. And if we need to sharpen our pencils, they understand the situation too. So it's been an awful financial situation. It still is a collaborative effort between, city and school side, which is much appreciated.
Yeah, thanks for that reflection too. I 100% agree. Since we've been out, I mean, since that date, just kind of bringing sort of a recapitulation to the whole conversation back to where we started. Since we left in March, middle of March 11th or 12th or so, or later, our last day was the 13th or something in the office. Dr. Wong was right by our side as we contemplated how to deal with the first COVID-19 exposure at Potter Road. And when we discovered that there were students also on the same bus that went to Hemingway, and we had to make immediate decisions. And since that day, we've been working in a collaborative spirit with our city leaders. I'm on a call every single morning with the mayor. She's invited me to be part of her meetings with the division heads, and I'm grateful to be part of that with all of our local legislators. And this, if anything has come from this, it's afforded us the opportunity to collaborate better than we ever have as a city. As the mayor kind of always describes it as just one Framingham. So I thank everybody for taking the time to to be with us, to hear us, to listen to us talk about a topic we seem to talk about every single minute of every single day. So if we've missed questions that you want to have addressed, feel free to reach out to me or Link or school committee, their administrative assistant, Joanna Hastry. We're happy to answer those questions and then respond back to you. Again, I thank you for your attention this evening. I thanks for your advocacy. Above all, I hope that you're safe. I hope that you're well, that you're taking care of one another, and that you're patient with us as we work right alongside of you to figure this out together. So, thanks everybody for a great evening, and be well. And if you choose to come in at 7 o'clock tonight for school committee, I'll see you there. Have a good evening.